Hi, my name is Diego Ayala, and I'll be refuting to Colin's claim that capital punishment is an ineffective way to deal with criminals. And the first claim that he made was that illegal representation is unfair. And I'm arguing that not all legal representation is ineffective because there are cases where defendants win and or evade the death sentence. So in using one piece of his evidence used in his speech, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer reports that in Washington State Penitentiary, 1 in 5 of the 84 people who have faced execution in the past 20 years were represented by lawyers who had been or were later disbarred, suspended, or arrested. Colin later calls these lawyers criminals in his speech. However, this evidence means that 4 out of the 5 people that faced execution were not criminals but accepted lawyers. Also, according to the Death Penalty Information Center concerning the federal death penalty, 161 capital cases have gone to trial with 15 resulting in verdicts of not guilty on all capital counts in the case. The remaining 146 cases have resulted in 95 life sentences and 51 death sentences. So of these trials, there were more cases in which they resulted in life sentences, meaning that the trial was successful in evading the death sentence. So his second claim was that the death penalty fails to deter crime. However, there is not enough evidence to directly correlate the death penalty and the deterrence on crime. He says that the death penalty is doing the opposite of what was intended and raises crime rates. However, there is not enough evidence to support that claim. Dudley Sharp, former vice president of Justice for All, says that it is not surprising that the U.S., which has executed only 0.06% of its murderers since 1967, does not overtly show a general deterrent effect. So, meaning that 0.06% is too small of a number to reference a correlation between the death penalty and the rate of homicide. So it would be generalizing to argue that the death penalty has an obvious and big effect on homicide rates because there are other causes of homicide that need to be considered, like murder motives or the mental health of the murderer. And his last claim was that the death penalty is more costly than life imprisonment. And I will argue that over time, the cost of cases that sought death penalty were much less than the murder cases that are capable of life in prison sentences. So I'm going to use Maryland as an example. And according to an example from the studies taken from the Death Penalty Information Center, the average cost in Maryland for a non-death penalty murder case is $1.1 million over the life of the case. And this is including imprisonment and trials. So, and while the cost of for a death penalty case is $3 million over the life of the case. So obviously, at the moment, $3 million is obviously higher than $1.1 million. But in 2004, there were only 5 inmates on death row in Maryland, adding up to a potential $15 million in total cost. In Baltimore alone, there were 210 cases of murder that did not seek death penalty, potentially adding up to $231 million. So over time, the murder cases in Maryland that do not seek the death penalty add up way higher than just 5 inmates who did seek. And in conclusion, Colin said that the legal representation is unfair, but not all of the legal representation is ineffective because there were cases where they ended up evading the death sentence. Second, the death penalty fails to deter crime. There's not a lot of evidence to directly correlate the two. And the death penalty is more costly than life imprisonment. At the moment, death penalty is more costly, but over a duration of time, the cost of life imprisonment adds up. And so there is not enough evidence and too much generalization to say that capital punishment is an ineffective way to deal with criminals. Thank you.
All right, well, you don't really preview the secondary claims, but you do signpost them as you get to them, so that helps quite a bit. I thought the first point, the question of fairness is a value claim, so you want to be a little bit careful about that. But I thought that the argument that you made really dealt less with fairness and rather dealt with the question of whether or not representation was effective. And I thought you did a very good job arguing for the effectiveness of the current representation, suggesting that the advocate's own evidence still suggests that 80% of the representation is not problematic. So that's a pretty substantial amount of effectiveness there. And I thought that the follow-up data, which showed that the vast majority of criminals who are represented in these cases don't get the death penalty, so they're either they are acquitted outright or they get life sentences, and as a consequence, that seems to suggest that their representation is pretty certain. I thought you did a very good job on that particular point. On the second argument, I think you get a little mixed up on a couple of arguments here. The advocate is presenting an argument that suggests that maybe the death penalty contributes to the crime rate, and you try to diminish that by suggesting that because the execution rates are so low, the percentage of people who are executed are so low, it couldn't really have that effect. I think the argument that the person that you're quoting is really making here is that we can't have a deterrent effect unless we exercise the death penalty more frequently, and then you don't present any follow-up evidence on whatever deterrent effect there might be. So I think you're missing a chance to make a stronger argument here. You kind of have a weak feint against an argument that was weak on the other side anyway, instead of going for what I think would be a stronger argument on that particular point. And that feels a little bit like a, I don't know, flavorless sauce. It needs to have something there that is more striking. Your argument on the third point on the cost issue, it's an interesting comparison. What's the inference that you want us to draw from that? I think there's a question here about what the inference is. It sounds to me like your real argument is that we ought to have the death penalty in those cases where it is deemed appropriate. Maybe it is worth $3 million sometimes to get rid of particular people or to make sure that they are in a place where they are threatened and there's some deterrent effect, and that it's always expensive whenever you're dealing with crime. So, but it's up to the prosecutors and the state to decide when they want to do those things. I think that's kind of the inference that you're making here, and that they don't decide to do it with everybody. They're not going after everybody in this particular case. And you've got Maryland example. They got 4 people on death row in Maryland, which is not a lot, at least compared to like California, where we got 600 people on death row here. I don't know when the last time Maryland executed anybody was. California was 2005, so it's 11 years ago that happened. And then your deterrence argument could apply based on that information too. All right, thank you.